In this video, we're going to be designing a brand identity for a record label that I made up called Inkjet, who mainly produces music in the hardcore, shoegaze, and punk genres, all the way from the initial brief to the final product. Let's get into it. All right, so when I'm working on a brand identity, or just building out a brand or a bigger project for any type of client, usually it starts with some kind of creative brief, either from them or something that we develop together if it's like completely from scratch. So here's the name, Inkjet Records. This is kind of the little brief of the brand, references DIY, physical printed aesthetic, ink smudges, old copy machine textures, CMYK, very raw, like unfinished look. So the target audience is going to be people who are 16 to 30 who have interest in alternative music like hardcore, punk, shoegaze, zines, screen printing stuff, live shows, physical music formats, underground scenes, and have nostalgia for analog stuff. So the tone of this brand needs to be DIY, raw, real, rebellious, youthful, nostalgic, but still very forward thinking and has a community driven approach. Some of the inspiration and references is like 80s and 90s punk zines, halftones, the misprinted color registration type stuff from CMYK. So the goals would be for Inkjet to be instantly recognizable, something that people would be proud to be around, something someone would want to slap on a sticker, attract bands who are cool, up and coming, vibrant, authentic, and really a part of this DIY community. So let's get into that early research phase. Once I hop off my initial call with the client or go over some kind of PDF that they sent over email like we just did, then my process usually starts with some kind of researching and mood boarding. This initial research phase can come in many forms, but it usually transpires in me doing some kind of online research combined with referencing one of the many design books that I have. For this project, initially, I started with what many designers do, and I just headed over to Pinterest. And I know Pinterest is kind of a cliche at this point for many designers in this phase, but I do still think as it serves as a good surface level thing for researching and mood boarding, at least on the aesthetic side. Once I poked around there for a while and I saved some stuff into my mood boards, I did some research in the various books I have. I have a lot of different design books these days, and some of them are very hyper specific, so I can usually find one that will apply to the project I'm working on. And since this project is mainly catered to the punk and hardcore and alternative music scenes, I knew I had many books that I could use for this project as reference. For this project specifically, I had some books about the punk scene in the 80s and 90s, a general archive book of some dope album covers, and just other archive style books that are related to the alternative music genres. For this project specifically, I also did some research on what other record labels were doing in this scene to get a feel for the overall environment and culture that other record labels are doing with their marketing assets, their branding, and just their overall approach to how they interact with their audience. After I do enough research and ideation and I start to feel like I have enough stuff to kind of gather and cultivate into the style that I want this brand to look like, I start by creating a mood board in Arena. And I like Arena specifically compared to a bunch of other cataloging or mood boarding websites because it doesn't have a bunch of ads or bullshit going on. It's just a really clean and simple user interface. So let's hop over into that real quick. So basically, the style that I'm going for is something that has a simple logo type, raw, kind of live concert style photography. A lot of this stuff is taken from different record labels, stuff that they post on their Instagrams, stuff like Sound and Fury. For the actual aesthetic of the assets, I like this look, right? Like something that's printed small, so it's very grainy and when it's in color and it has a lot of that color noise, and then the black and white pictures being very contrasty and punchy, but also I want everything to have this like lines through it, right? Like that copy scan texture, but I want to actually print everything out for real. So there's a lot of different variation, and that way the colors and the brand identity will almost be like leave room for that error and mistake, and it'll kind of lean into the ethos of the brand. Some other references for posters, album arts. I really like these printed style gradients like this from this old Honda ad. And see like this kind of almost screen printing color halftone type thing. There's another example that shows it a little bit better. Something like this, right? I like this look. That's pretty much our basic little mood board, and now we just have to get into some of the actual work.
I'm not your friend. I'm your enemy.
At this point, I felt pretty ready to start doing some actual work, and to start that off, we had to focus and develop the inkjet logo design. We started by looking through some fonts. I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to do from the get-go, but I still had to put myself through that no stone unturned type of search it is when you go through all the different fonts and you're just clicking through it endlessly, and almost like a meme at this point, right? For designers, that process of looking for fonts. It does work out though, because I can lay everything out and figure out which looks best for the brand or whatever album art, poster, whatever I'm working on. I knew I wanted to lean into this ink smudge and ink bleed aesthetic that felt very in line with the inkjet brand and the name inkjet, but also in line with the brief that the client had. So for the base of our logo, I ended up going with Alta Haas Grotesque, and I simultaneously was experimenting with some things that would work as an alternative mark or a symbol. That way we have a full logo type and another alternative mark for when the full writing can't be displayed on different assets. Alta Haas Grotesque worked really good as a base because it has that slight roundness and ink bleed features already built in, but it could also work as the typography for this brand for larger copy and headlines and stuff like that. I didn't want to just leave it as completely base though, so to give the inkjet logo type a bit more uniqueness and that analog feel that was in the brief, I brought the tracking in hella, and then honestly I printed it out on this transparent vellum paper. When you print out graphics on this transparent paper, especially with these inkjet printers, it stays wet for about 10 to 15 seconds, so you have a little bit of time to distress it and smudge it. So I moved it around with my fingers, giving it that kind of one of one feel. And what's kind of cool is, we're making this with the inkjet printer, and that's the name of the brand. So even though no one will really know how it was made once they see the final product, it's a cool little Easter egg for me as a designer making this. Once I scanned that back in, I went over to Photoshop and brought the logo into the digital space so I can make it into a logo type that we could actually use for different assets. I generated a full clean version, a more distressed version to use when we want style to take the forefront over legibility, and then a smaller version that's broken down that just says inkjet. Like I said before, in addition to this logo type, I also wanted a small symbol that we could use as part of the brand identity, and I was super inspired by all the different printing marks, like the crop marks and registrations and stuff. When you print stuff out on these CMYK inkjet printers, they almost look like little target wheels or crosshairs or different little, just cool little assets really. And it did feel pretty on the nose to use this as one of our main symbols, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to include a nice little Easter egg. They usually almost always live in the CMYK space because printers like this are usually printing in cyan, yellow, magenta, and key. And at first I wanted to use that color palette, but since I was already using the name and the ink bleed and the smudge, it started to feel a little bit too on the nose. So to explore this, but also keep it in this kind of same world, I just changed the hue slightly of the CMYK and moved it around to different values so we could come up with our own palette that stays with those same complementary colors like that, but have a slightly different feeling and don't follow exactly in line with the CMYK colors. So what I landed on were these ones that I named Blue Note, Perma Orange, Nuclear Green, and Key Black. And another brand color that will be used here and there is this 50% neutral gray. I was really stoked with how these really bright colors turned out, and it ended up being a perfect color palette to explore with the brand because the rest of our assets were going to be this very printed texture, muted and kind of desaturated. So it's nice to have a pop of color in there. I love Alta Haas Grotesque too, but I didn't want the brand to be entirely in that one font and over dominated by that really common sans serif. So I did some exploring over on Adobe fonts, Monotype, and a few other typeface websites so that I can find a perfect font for our body copy. And honestly, I really did stumble upon the perfect one, and it was by none other than the great Typodermic fonts. And this font was called Chain Printer, and it was exactly what I needed. It was a small and more condensed font, and it had all caps, but it still felt very in line with the rest of our brand because it had this kind of typewriter-esque ink bleed feel, and you had to put the tracking all the way into like -125. So I wrote that in the kind of brand identity booklet. At this point, we had our simple visual identity system pretty locked in. We had our suite of different inkjet record logo types, the alternative symbol to use on brand assets, our vibrant color palette, and a typographic system that was comprised of Altahas Grotesque Bold, Altahas Grotesque Regular, and our chain printer font for our micro body copy. Now, before we get into creating a bunch of different other branding assets, let's see how this design system holds up when applying it to a website. So normally at this point, I would work on some branding, packaging, social media stuff, and just other general branding assets. However, this video is kindly sponsored by our friends over at Framer, so we're going to hop into the website design now. Quite honestly, I wanted this website to be pretty simple, basically just some kind of landing page that would showcase the artists that were on the Inkjet roster, and just a place for people to get general info about the record label. So I started this little process by browsing a bunch of the amazing templates that Framer has to offer, and settled in on this one that was for a creative studio, but I knew it would work really well for applying it to a record label website. I had to make quite a few bit adjustments to make it work out, but in the end, it ended up being great. For the overall kind of color and aesthetic of the website, I wanted to make the background heavy on this 50% gray color we had, also the dark blacks, but have little pops of color that are incorporated through the imagery or the different typography. Honestly, since this website was super clean and had like very modern animations and layout, I was surprised at how well the rough, more rugged typefaces fit into the aesthetic and flow of this website. But it ended up working great. I think it created a nice juxtaposition between this clean presentation and this more rough and gritty type. Also, my assets were pretty distressed and rough too, because for all the different bands, I made sure to print out the photos in this draft mode. So they had all the lines through it, right? When you print them on the inkjet printer. So it would have this very like distressed color, distorted copy scan kind of look, right? With muted colors and feel very in line with the type of energy that these bands bring in the hardcore, punk, and shoegaze scenes. In addition to the rough typography, part of the branding was to also use a lot of imagery from live concerts that felt very energetic rather than just using portraits or promo photos of the band. Framer made it really easy for me to build out this website, and I did start with a template, but at the end of the day, I was able to customize it quite a bit and get it to turn out exactly how I wanted. So let me show you how it all came together. So here's a final look at the website for Inkjet Records. This is the desktop version. You get here on the home page and you're greeted by this cool kind of cursor effect with these big, bold, flashing images that I think helps immediately set the tone and energy of what we're going for. We have a little navigation system up here with the logo, our chain printer font that ended up looking really good even in this kind of very modern style layout. Link to the Instagram. Scroll down, sweet little opening effect. Then we have our kind of champion title here. And then we have this little about page with the who we are. And this is where I started incorporating a little bit of pop of color. And as you can see, all our images are treated with this kind of printed copy scan effect that I applied by printing out each image in the draft mode. And then when you scroll down, like I said, this is supposed to be like a almost showcase for the different bands and music that this label would produce. So we have the green that starts to pop up here, and we have little images where you have a hover effect. These are the different bands, and I gave them signifier of what type of specific music it is, as well as where they're from. So Mongrel, San Diego Hardcore, Super Heaven, Pennsylvania Shoegaze. And then at the bottom, we have this little slogan that I was pretty proud about: designed to amplify what's worth pressing into wax. And then you have this artist page that has all those artists that we already talked about, but then the other ones too: Never Ending Game, Fury. So I'll show you how it looks. Like if we click on, this big boy one, right? We have this blue that starts to get present here, the genre, the year that they started, and where they're from, and just like kind of like cool description of the band, and then more just images that were treated in that style. And normally if this was a company where we were selling the albums to, we'd probably have the different a shop page or the different albums within here, but this is more just like a showcase. Contact page, pretty simple, nothing too crazy there. And then a nice about page, who we are. Inkjet Records, a record label dedicated to raw, loud, and emotionally honest. We put out records for bands pushing sound and feeling in the worlds of hardcore, punk, shoegaze, and everything noisy in between. And just some more kind of auxiliary images that we could place in here to give it a little visual interest. These are just some photos of my of my wife and my homies. I took on this little toy camera that I have that adds this cool effect. So I put them in as the different people who work here. And just something simple like that. Nice little Easter egg. That's pretty much a walkthrough though for this website. And if you want to build your own website, either for a client or for yourself, make sure to check out the link in the description to sign up for Framer today. I think they're an awesome website building tool and something that I always have a lot of fun messing around with. Now let's get into the rest of the project. Now that we have the brand identity system and the website locked in, it was time to build out the world more with some other assets. This is quite honestly my favorite part of any branding project, is building out all the assets and the cool graphics and just the stuff that I really like working on. It's almost like a little treat, right? The tough logo design work, the really like grinding out, trying to figure out how you want something to look. That part is fun and rewarding, but once you get here is when you really get to explore and have fun with a lot of things. And I knew to start this, I wanted to create some vinyl record sleeves, some out-of-home marketing stuff, and just overall social media assets that the Inkjet brand could use. I started this process by working on a test pressing record sleeve. Seems like most record labels these days, especially ones in the more DIY scene, have some kind of white label record template, similar to what a lot of the house and techno type of musics were doing, with some kind of sticker on it. So I wanted to fall in line with that kind of theme, and honestly, the brand applied really perfectly to that style of aesthetic, and I whipped up this cool little orange record sleeve thing. And from there, I was just cooking. Over the next day or two, whenever I had time, I was working on a bunch of different assets that I got inspired to keep making more and more cool shit. I did some out-of-home, like wheat paste style graphics for posters or for announcing new bands on the record label, and just various different colors worked really well, especially when you placed it over these more muted and kind of distorted assets. And like I said, for most of the stuff, I printed out all the photos in this draft mode on the printer, so it got that really grainy feel and those nice copy scan lines. And what was cool is all of these were printed out at different sizes and scales and orientations, so it didn't feel like a template or just using the same texture over and over. And that kind of spontaneity and irregularness that was applied to all the different assets kind of worked with the brand identity itself, because it was kind of rough, DIY. Everything's not perfect, but that's the whole point. I also created 3 to 4 different styles of some out-of-home marketing stuff, like billboards. I feel like that's a huge marketing tool in the music world, especially in these DIY scenes. So posters, billboards, wheat paste stuff. And I was really stoked on how this poster series came out for a little fictional festival that Inkjet would throw called Full Bleed. So I incorporated the different branding colors, and I used transparent paper to print on the Inkjet printer with the type, and then I laid it over the more subdued different assets of the bands like Fury and Mongrel and Big Boy. Some other stuff I started building out too, getting creative with it. Some assets that the Inkjet record label could use for Instagram, badges for the employees who worked at the record label itself, and just some really cool merch concepts for some shirts and hoodies. And overall, over the next few days, I just built out a bunch of different stuff, and the footage was kind of all over the place because I would just get a random little idea and bust it out and screen record it. But I wanted to give you a final look at some of the brand assets and how I applied this overall Inkjet Records brand to kind of build out this world and system into different marketing assets, social media, environmental stuff, posters, merch, and more. So check it out. That's a wrap on Inkjet Records. I hoped you enjoyed seeing a look into my process for how I would create a simple brand identity for a company. I really had a lot of fun working on this one, the Inkjet Record brand itself and the video. And thank you so much again to Framer for sponsoring this video. If you want to learn more about them and make your own website for yourself or a business today, then check out the link in the description. That's it for now, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.